Here it is,
Mr.
folks.
Blumenthal.
I'm going to just put this for my own
Mr. Blunt.
convenience here. There's going to be a gazillion recordings of this, but this
Mr.
is just my
Booker.
own. They are voting on the
Mr.
Kavanaugh
Bozeman.
nomination.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito.
It's a lady in a wheelchair
Mr.
being
Cardin.
moved across.
Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy.
They're doing the vote now.
Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
So there's a bunch of protesters. I'm on the Fox News link via Facebook.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker.
They've had to get the Sergeant at Arms remove people like 3 times.
Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
I'd just sit up there with a taser.
Yeah, they should have done it during the committee meetings.
I don't know they let other
The
people.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the
What are
gallery.
they saying? I don't remember.
Shame on you.
Guilty until innocent.
So,
Mr. Cornyn.
Ow.
No due
Ms.
process.
Cortez
I
Masto.
don't think they're saying that, but they should.
Mr. Cotton.
How would you say? What do you say? What do you say?
Mr. Crapo.
I should speak to mine.
Mr. Cruz.
Yeah. Or speak louder.
Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly.
I got it cranked up as high as possible.
Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
the Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hogan. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee.
Mike Lee.
Mr. Manchin.
Manchin is a Democrat. That's an aye. Yeah, I knew that was going to
Clerk will
happen.
suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
Shame.
Manchin's a yes.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
Wow. they
Sergeant
went
at Arms
rabid.
will restore order in the gallery.
What were they saying? When
Shame on you.
Wags a little bit. Because they feel like Joe Manchin.
I want to make him.
Clerk may continue.
He's a Democrat.
Mr.
He
Markey.
gets to go with the group think, you know.
He's fun.
Mrs. McCaskey.
Yeah, Manchin was really the
Can't think
deciding
for
vote.
himself.
Mr.
But
McConnell.
he's not from a crazy Democratic state, so
He won't get reelected.
Mr. Menendez.
he's trying. But
Mr. Merkley.
I bet he does.
There's Menendez from New Jersey.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy.
Unfortunately, when the senators
Mrs. Murray.
stand, you can't hear what they say. That's
Mr.
a no is
Nelson.
a no.
Mr. Paul.
Rand Paul's aye.
Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch.
Rage.
Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, no.
Mr. Sass.
Yeah, it's hard to hear that.
Mr. Schatz.
You can't
Oh,
hear
yeah.
how they're voting, so it's
Mr.
They don't have a
Schumer.
microphone on.
it's not as good as if we.
Yeah, we have better
Scott.
microphones in the Arkansas Senate. I really wish you could hear them.
Mrs.
Yes or no,
Shaheen.
it's so important.
Yes.
Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith.
There should be a red light, green light.
Yeah.
They
Ms.
press.
Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis.
You hear that one?
Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen.
You have to walk all the way out.
Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
I think that's all of them. Yeah, if it's a tie, then Vice President Mike Pence can. Murkowski standing up.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
That was slick. That was pretty slick. The guy wanted to walk his
Senators
daughter down
voting in
aisle.
the affirmative.
He was a yes.
Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt,
That was a no.
Bozeman, Burr,
So she
Capito,
voted to, like,
Cassidy,
abstain.
Collins, Corker, Cornyn,
He was- he
Cotton,
was- if he said
Crapo,
yes, she would say
Cruz,
no. She said, so we
Enzi,
cancel each other out.
Ernst,
So it didn't
Fisher,
He
Blake,
got to go to the win.
Gardner,
Blake is a yes.
Graham, Grassley,
Grassley.
Hatch,
Hatch.
Heller, Hovind, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Blankford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman,
No
Rich,
Murkowski.
Roberts,
Yeah, she
Rounds,
did that deal.
Rubio,
But we got
Sass,
Manchin.
Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis,
I think
Toomey,
Collins.
Wicker, Young.
Razor.
Right, yeah. It's like voting matters. GOTV.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the number? What's the number? It's 51. They don't need a vice president. It's 50. They do.
Senators voting in the negative. Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Hardin, Casey,
Yeah.
Coons,
turn the air on.
Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden.
So I think it's like 47
Murphy.
against.
Mr. Murphy, no.
That's 48. But I think he needs a simple majority. I don't think he needs 50.